Yeah, welcome back, everybody. I'm here with the amazing Chad McBain. My name's Luke McBain. Together, we're two brothers in Bitcoin. And Chad, you sent me again something really interesting. Let me see if I can make that available to everybody else. And it is this article here. Okay, here we got it. Russia officially legalizes Bitcoin and cryptocurrency mining. Russia has officially legalized Bitcoin and cryptocurrency mining, marking a significant change in its approach to digital currencies. Okay, so the new law allows registered mining firms to operate legally while offering certain protections and monitoring mechanisms. So Russia has been in the news a lot lately, especially because of the war with Ukraine. And now we
Right.
have this bit of news where they
Yeah.
apparently legalize it, where I assume prior to this legalization it had been banned. I assume now, I don't know, maybe it was just a gray area or there was no legislation.
Well,
Um, yeah,
so again, I'm not too familiar with the Russian political infrastructure, but my understanding was there was kind of two groups within Russia, the Russian government, with kind of opposing opinions. So one of them, and I don't believe it was the central bank, I think it was the Ministry of Finance or something like that, or their version of it, um, thought that it was okay to have Bitcoin and acquire Bitcoin, but you weren't allowed to transact in Bitcoin as a currency, but as uh, a savings or an asset or a commodity or speculative type of investment. I think the one arm of the Russian government was okay with it, and then the central bank of Russia said absolutely not, and it's not a currency, and you're not allowed to hold it, and everyday Russians weren't allowed to have it. And then something came out, I don't know, I'm going to say 2 years ago now, maybe a year ago, where the high net worth individuals within Russia were allowed to at least hold it. And so now we see this. So I don't claim to be an expert on what's going on in Russia, that's for sure. But to me, what's clearly happening is um, Vladimir Putin and probably some of his advisors and using it for trade is one way to try and get around U.S. sanctions or European and U.S. sanctions in regards to the war in Ukraine. Now, some could view that as a bad thing. Um, I'm going to take the non-political stance here and just say that um, Bitcoin is for everybody, whether we agree with their political ideologies or not. And clearly, members in the Russian government, maybe Putin himself, have decided that with the inability to access their funds held by the U.S. Fed and the inability to transact in U.S. dollars globally, um, there's different avenues that they need to seek out to try and have international trade. And before anybody gets too upset about the fact that you can use Bitcoin to do this, I will also point out that they also use the euro and the yen and other currencies. So it's not like, Bitcoin's the only way to get around US sanctions. There's many ways to do it. Stockpiling cash and gold are also other ways that are very common to do it. So I don't think this is going to be a huge thing for Russia. I think it just opens up one more avenue for them to try and do international trade um, easier than what has been in the past. But like I said, they're also using other major currencies like the euro, like the yen, gold, and cash. So this is just another avenue for them. And for Bitcoin, I think it's quite interesting. You now have nation states, admittedly, mining Bitcoin. We already know that El Salvador does. There's plenty of evidence to suggest that Iran does. and now Russia is admitted to doing it. So it's quite interesting in terms of the growth of Bitcoin from an international or global perspective.
Yeah, I mean, here we have a graph showing basically cryptocurrency mining by country. And this is actually Bitcoin because it says BTC hash rate.
Right.
And here we see that astonishing, again, it's surprising for me to see that China still has so much of the hash rate, although mining was banned in China. Strange.
Yeah, well, and the interesting thing about that graph is China at one time had closer to about 65-70%. Then they had a crackdown in 2021, and that dropped down to as low as about 12%. But a year and a half ago, it was announced that Hong Kong was going to open up cryptocurrency trading and Bitcoin trading. And of course, Hong Kong theoretically doesn't do an awful lot without China saying it's okay, at least when it comes to finance. So that was kind of the first flag, I guess, of maybe China was changing its opinion a little bit on Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. And then just recently, it was announced that Hong Kong would also be launching Bitcoin and Ethereum ETFs. So I'm not surprised to see that hash rate up. I'm surprised to see it at 57%. But I'm not shocked in the least that it's back up to a high level. And the U.S. Continues to shoot itself in the foot, in my personal opinion, because they could have probably had twice as much as they currently have, but they've been very, at least the Democratic administration has been very hostile towards Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. So I think that's why we're seeing the US 35% when they, as recently as a year ago, were over 50%.
Well, yeah, although we do see like a trend here that it is increasing since 2021, 2022, but there is some increase in the United States.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a lot higher, but it's not, considering that the vast majority of Bitcoin and crypto companies are US, well, I shouldn't say they're US based anymore, but many of them were actually started by Americans. So it should be much higher in the US, and it just bad policy so far has probably limited its growth. But to your point, it is still growing at a pretty nice pace. So.
And I mean, what we talked about previously was also that the Trump camp and the RFK Jr. camp, they are very much in favor of boosting still the cryptocurrency mining sector in the United States to really make sure that this becomes more than 35%.
Yeah, I believe that will continue to grow over time. We haven't heard from the Harris campaign in regards to Bitcoin or cryptocurrency at large, for that matter. Maybe we will in the near future. We haven't really heard much from the Harris campaign about any policy at this point, but I'm assuming that will change after the national convention of the Democratic Party in the next week or two, actually. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm just looking through the remaining articles, cryptocurrency laws around the world. Yeah, I mean, this is just, we know that countries around the world have taken various approaches to cryptocurrency regulation. Some nations embrace it, and others impose strict regulations or outright bans.
Yeah,
yeah.
I think for a lot of countries, which, well, let's just say governments, it's an ebb and flow situation. I mean, we saw Germany just a few weeks ago sell basically all of the Bitcoin that had acquired through search and seizure and other ways. And I think it came out to 2 or 3 billion US dollars. And then about a week later, again, maybe you're more familiar with this than I am, I don't know, but apparently somebody in the German government kind of said, oh, maybe we shouldn't have sold it all. And there were reports coming out that they were buying some back. Like I think that's an indication of governments are still trying to wrap their heads around whether this is something that can help them or hurt them, or how does it work. And governments like control, and Bitcoin's not something that's controllable, but at the same time, it is something that they can use for financial leverage. So um, I think a lot of governments are still struggling with where they stand on it, and that changes week to week, month to month.
Yeah, and as we've discussed previously, I mean, it was interesting for me to see that other cryptocurrency like Tether does bolster the treasury bonds in the United States, for
Right.
example. And now there's the recommendation to take Bitcoin onto the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve, something like this, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so there is that part which could obviously benefit governments and nation states if they decide to see this as a benefit for I mean, you're right. I mean, this is they're still puzzled, but apparently more and more there are now also to be seen some opportunities, or some politicians do see some opportunities in cryptocurrency. It's not only seen as competition for
Right.
the national currency. Yeah.
Yeah, and again, I think it depends on your jurisdiction. I mean, for the US, it seems like such a no-brainer because of the stablecoin situation, as we discussed in a previous podcast from a few weeks ago. The stablecoin market now is the 18th largest buyer and holder of US currency in the world. There's 196 countries in the world in any given day, and so you could argue that crypto stable coins are in the top 10% of all global holders of the US dollar. So for the US to not try and take advantage of that would seem, quite frankly, just silly. But wrapping their heads around it is something they're going to have to do. And then I think when the US does start to wrap their head around it, or even beforehand, we're going to see other countries realize what's happening and want to get some leverage as well. So countries like Russia or China or Saudi Arabia aren't going to want to just sit back and watch trillions and trillions of dollars in US currency being bought up by stable coins and not be a part of that action in some way, shape, or form. So interesting times. Yeah, interesting times.
I mean, you were just mentioning that the German government, I think it was a federal state, they just dumped all sorts of the Bitcoin stash, which they had impounded. And this was also in these recent event of that Bitcoin crash, and which there has been a little bit of recovery, but not complete recovery. And I think one of the criticisms which is leveraged at Bitcoin is that sometimes it behaves like a stock, like
Right.
it crashes like other stocks. It's like a tech stock basically, and we both know it's not a stock, and maybe people think it is, but it's not at all. Why do you think that this has happened? For example, this whole crash. Why does it behave sometimes like a stock?
I think the easiest answer to that is liquidity. So what I mean by that is how much Bitcoin is available at any given time to be traded. So we know there's 21 million Bitcoin. And we know that, well, there's not quite 21 million yet, but there will be 21 million once it's all mined. We know that approximately 19.5 million have already been mined. So that's out there in the world. But of that 19.5 million Bitcoin that's been mined, we know that, and we know this just because of what's on the exchanges globally, we know that there's about 1.8 million Bitcoin on all exchanges. So roughly 10% of all Bitcoin that's ever been mined is available for trading. So 90% of all Bitcoin that has ever been mined is not available for trading. So when you're dealing with only 10% of the total market, when something happens, good or bad, lots of buying or lots of selling, it can really sway the price. based on the supply and demand curve of what's available. But I think the key to that statement is 90% of all Bitcoin that's ever been mined is not available for anybody to purchase or sell, you know, in any given day, just because most people buy Bitcoin and store it, at least for now. I do think that they'll start to use it in some way, shape, or form as the price fluctuations start to even out. At what price that is, I don't know, whether it's 100,000 US or 200 or 500, who knows? But right now it's still in that growth stage. It's aggressive growth. And so we're seeing you can go from 60,000 to 50,000 literally in a day. It can go from 60,000 to 70,000 literally in a day. But if you zoom out and you look at it from a more broad perspective, which you and I have talked about before, Bitcoin is worth more today than it was a year ago. A year ago, it was worth more than it was 3 years before that, and so on and so forth. And so on on August, I think 31st, 2014, Bitcoin was roughly $300 and some US. So that's 10 years ago. And I don't know what it is today, but when I looked yesterday, I think it was around 60,000, 59.5. So I think the fluctuations are simply the lack of available Bitcoin to be traded. That could be a good thing when there's lots of buying on any particular day, the price goes up. And when there's lots of selling, the price goes down. And those swings can be pretty wild, 10% swings sometimes in a day. Yeah.
Yeah, well, yeah, it was just interesting to know that it's sort of like, because the criticism sometimes also is, well, if it's digital gold, why isn't it a hedge against like the stock market crashing? Because it's sort of like crashed with the stock market simultaneously.
Right.
And so a lot of people, and I mean, I think the criticism is valid to that point, that say, well, it doesn't protect me from those crashes in some way, which gold usually would do better, is still doing a better job at. Yeah.
So I would love to debate that to some extent. But we're not doing a debate today, but I'll push back slightly on that. So first of all, you're 100% correct. I think that is the general consensus of people when they look at Bitcoin from a price perspective. However, at its worst, in 2022, I guess the fall of 2022, it was still twice as much as what it was worth 2 years ago, or 2 years prior to that. So to me, that is a store of value, because if you bought it 2 years earlier, and point, it was still twice as valuable as it was 2 years prior to when you bought it, then that is a good store of value. I don't know that stocks, when they crash, are worth twice as much as they were when you bought. The second part I would say to that is Bitcoin didn't crash. When you look at it from that perspective, it was still twice as much as its low point from 2 years ago. Then it didn't crash nearly as bad as most stocks did at the time. And when in the spring of 2023, when the banks started to fail in the US, Silicon Valley Bank, I can't remember, there was another one in New York. I think there was 3 in 1 month in March of 2023. People can Google that. Bitcoin's price doubled in the course of about 45 days. So it was clearly a flight to safety for some people when the banks started to fail. So is it digital gold? Well, you know, we can debate that, I suppose. But what I would say is stocks are something that if you listen to most financially wise people, you buy them in good companies and you leave them alone and you go about your life. And over time, they will accrue and start to gain much more worth than when you bought. If you do the same with Bitcoin, I think you'll find that it's the same thing. Gold is the same thing. Gold in the late 90s was $300 an ounce US. Now it's $2,500 an ounce US. But there were plenty of times in between when it probably went up or down from what that point of $300. So I don't look at Bitcoin on a day-to-day or week-to-week or even month-to-month and say, oh, it's not performing like it was supposed to. If you look at it from what would you say, a time perspective of 5 years, which I think is very reasonable when you're looking at midterm investments or long-term investments. I think Bitcoin over a 5-year period, you can pick any 5-year period, I think has done very well, you know, better than anything else for sure. I can't think of anything else that's done as well. And remember, at its core, it's not really supposed to be an investment. It's an investment right now because it's an ecosystem that continues to grow. But at some point, the price will level out. And that's when I think it starts to really assume the characteristics of gold. What people don't think about when they talk about gold is $2,500 today. Well, 10 years ago, it was $1,600. So what's the inflation been in the last 10 years? And when you factor in inflation, gold isn't even holding its value. When you factor in inflation with Bitcoin, it more than exceeds that. You know, we've had 40% inflation just in the last 4 years. You know, well, Bitcoin's a lot more than 40% higher than it was 4 years ago. But gold isn't. Gold was at $2,000 4 years ago. So it's at its best so far, it's only up 20%. So you'd be upside down 20% in your purchasing power if you'd bought gold 4 years ago. And I can speak to that because I came this close to buying gold 4 years ago when the pandemic first. And several discussions, and my wife decided, no, getting Bitcoin. And look, that wasn't an easy decision, especially 4 years ago. There's a lot more information out there now, which is why we're doing this. But thankfully, that's what we decided. And look, Bitcoin wasn't the only thing we thought of, but it certainly has outperformed anything else. The only thing that might have come close would be real estate. But again, it's not easy for people to acquire real estate. And real estate isn't liquid. If you want to get some of your money out of real estate, it's a process and it's costly and time consuming, and you know, so that's my rant.
And you get taxed also on top of that.
Yeah.
For your real estate.
Yeah. So I mean, real estate certainly has its place, but if we're comparing, you could say, well, real estate's up 40% in the last 4 years, and that's true. But then when you look at the friction costs of holding it, maintaining it, selling it, paying taxes on it, it's no longer equal to inflation. It's you might have gained 20% of real estate, not 40, in which case you're upside down by 20%. Now, the one caveat to real estate is most people need a place to live. So if it's your primary residence that we're talking about, well, I don't know how you factor that in, but to me, that's worth it because you do need a place to live. But if you're just investing in real estate, Bitcoin's far better.
Yeah, and I mean, coming back to our lead story about Russia legalizing mining, we do see that like this projection and that the general narrative just holds true, that more and more institutions and countries are turning around and are changing their perspective on Bitcoin and trying to now make use of it in some way. Because that is something, I mean, what you hear, well, also what you already heard 2-3 years ago by, I would say, Bitcoin experts, I heard this, is that censoring Bitcoin just won't work. It's not going to work. No. So some countries are trying to do that. They're trying to ban Bitcoin, but then, you know, the Bitcoin miners just pack up their things and continue somewhere else, and it doesn't stop people from holding or buying Bitcoin in these countries. And basically all they're doing is losing out on certain opportunities, economic opportunities, you know, whatever opportunities there are within the mining industry, for example. So because it seems like the argument is always, well, it's uncensorable anyway because it's decentralized and it's global. So there's no way of just getting rid of it. And as we also previously discussed, now in the United States, there's also this swing towards Bitcoin, and approving the ETFs and all that makes it just almost now impossible to ban it there or to get rid of it. So the only other way is to say, well, are we going to get on the bandwagon sooner or later? And some say, well, we better start dealing with it now because it's not going away. Yeah, and other countries still decide to basically put their, yeah, just to still try to ignore the phenomena or not try to deal with it creatively or constructively or sell their Bitcoin or whatever and say, well, this is just, maybe this is just an asset people are speculating with that we're not interested in. So but we're seeing clearly that bit by bit, these huge institutions are coming around.
Yeah, I'm a little surprised at this stage. Like, let's pick on Germany for a minute. In the summer of 2024, that they would choose to sell the Bitcoin that they have. But to your point, I think when you live in that ecosystem, or for lack of a better term, that bubble, I don't know that they see it as anything more than what you described as a speculative asset or bubble, and then they can trade it for US dollars or for euros or whatever. But, just in the conversation that we're having here today, their euros and their US dollars and their francs and everything else that people use, these governments, they continue to lose purchasing power. And so, why you wouldn't have Bitcoin or gold on your balance sheet, if for no other reason to just try and maintain your purchasing power, just is beyond me. And the fact that these so-called finance ministers don't see this really makes me question because to me this isn't difficult, really makes me question their ability to actually understand finance and currency. And I think when I say that, I'm not saying I'm smarter than them, but because I'm not in their bubble or their field, if you will, I might be able to just have a more open mind to other things. So maybe they can't. But, when I talk to my own children who are saving in Canadian dollars, I tell them to either invest it or buy something tangible with it, because a year from now, it won't be worth what that dollar figure says. So, for instance, if my daughter had $1,000 in the bank a year ago and still has $1,000, well, she's probably lost $100 of that in purchasing power. And so,
to the subject of politics, I mean, politics is a strange beast, but you made a very good point, and it's, I think, good to return to that. Is, well, it seems that the Trump campaign has discovered that there are now in the United States so many cryptocurrency holders that you can't just disregard them anymore, politically speaking. There are too many people holding cryptocurrency and probably also too many now investment companies being invested in this that you can just disregard or even be outright hostile towards it and make this even part of your, I don't know, political statement, because you're just damaging yourself in the process. So I think politics is also, an expression of trying to feel what people want in the best possible sense. It's not always that, I'm not saying this, but politicians are also swayed by, I don't know, what people are interested in. And here in Germany, or you don't feel, I don't know, you don't see a lot of interest in that subject. There are some people interested in, but is this interest broad enough to influence politics in a Bitcoin friendly way that they go like, okay, now we have to deal with it, because if we don't, we start, acting against our own best interests, which is to remain power or to get power again. So, yeah.
Well, on the outside looking in, I guess what surprises me about Germany is from a North American standpoint, I'm generalizing, of course, and I don't speak for everybody, but I feel that Germany is looked at as the central financial powerhouse of Europe, and as the one stable country and economy that always makes the right, and I'm not talking politically, but the right conservative decision, so that they never put themselves in harm's way like other countries have done with their finances. And so to me, Germany is, this, at least from a financial standpoint, over the last, I don't know, 20, 30, 40 years, is this financial bedrock that you could always count on to make good financial decisions. And so that struck me in a world where the people making the decisions in Germany, who I would think are some of the most intelligent financial minds on the planet, can see that the US is printing a ton of money, devaluing currencies all around the world that back themselves by the US dollar. So to have them then sell something that's gaining traction on the US dollar just surprised me, I guess. That's all. Yeah.
It's probably just a short-term decision, and yeah, just to,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, it's not a criticism.
No, it's a fair criticism. I'm just saying that sometimes, yeah, like they just maybe want to, bolster the deficit with something,
Yeah.
and again,
well,
where is the political interest in the topic? I think politics is not really, that might surprise some people, rational in this way. It's not always making about rational decisions. It's more about, well, what topic do I focus on, which gives me power or helps me to retain power. And if this doesn't do anything because I can just sell the Bitcoin and nobody cares, my constituency just doesn't care if I keep it or sell it,
right,
then I sell it, because just even though rationally it makes more sense to keep it, it doesn't matter. It's not about rational. It's about, what does this serve my political interests in this moment? Yeah. And we are still removed from that more than I think. But I mean, probably just like everything else, Europe will catch up to the United States and say, well, no, this is in our best interest, politically speaking, to look at this more seriously. It'll just take a little bit more time.
Well, I agree with you. And the country that I suspect will come to that conclusion first is probably Germany.
Oh, well,
just because they seem to be much more financially savvy than most other countries in Europe. Yeah. And to that point, and again, I don't have the article, but I did see just a week ago, there was some German high-ranking official saying, maybe it wouldn't hurt to have a little bit, So who knows?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's already started to have those conversations that a year from now, maybe that's the decision. But if you're right, and I think you are, I would lay my odds on Germany would be the one to figure it out before anybody else. Yeah.
Let's see what happens. We'll stay tuned. Stay tuned.
Yeah.
Well, good talking to you. Thanks for sharing this article and interesting developments in terms of what's happening in Russia. And we'll talk again soon.
Okay, sounds great.
Okay, take care.
You too. Bye-bye.